You're listening to Microscast, the podcast about all things Micros.
Well, that's really nerdy.
Nerdy or not, here we go. This is Microscast with your host, Ed. Intellectual, stimulating conversation.
Hello, everyone. This is Edgar Carrillo, and you are listening to Microscast. Welcome. Thanks for listening. Okay, so I haven't released an episode of Microscast in quite some time. It's been over a month, and I want to apologize. I want to give you a little bit of an explanation. I am now in a very busy time at work. I am also returning back to school. Well, I have returned to school. I'm taking classes, and I made the mistake of signing up for 8-week classes as opposed to like a semester-long class. So the work is heavily condensed in 8 weeks. So I have things due every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and sometimes Saturdays. So it's a lot of work. It's taking a lot of my time. Like, I thought that being back to school would wake up the student in me to like get things done and stuff, but I've realized that the student in me has never been that good of a student. So I'm hoping that being older and wiser and having learned from a lot of my mistakes in my youth will help me this time around. So I'm trying to get my associates. I never finished my bachelor's, so I'm, taking baby steps. I realized that I only need about 20 more credits, or actually 27 more credits to get my associates. So I'm focusing on getting those credits and getting my associates so I can afterwards get my bachelor's. I'm not sure if I still want to do political science and economics, because plans have changed. Plans change over time. People change. So yeah, thank you for sticking by me. Thank you for sticking by this podcast. I also want to let you guys know that the next episode will be my one-on-one with Salome. I recorded that a while ago. Because of work and school, I haven't gotten around to editing it. I started a little bit today. I'm hoping that I can start making notes first about what are the sections that I want to edit out and keep and all that, because I had a 2-hour conversation that was literally just one of the most fun conversations that I've had in this podcast as my one-on-ones. So I really want to get that out. I want to apologize in advance if the information seems a little outdated, but it was a good interview. I always have a lot of fun talking to Salome, so stay tuned for that. That should be out sometime within the next 2 weeks. So for this episode, what I want to do is do a solo... this is basically a solo episode. I want to do a mind dump of Alduria-Wechua. So because I've been kind of busy these last couple months with school and work, I really haven't had much of a chance to be able to organize all of the thoughts in my head, all of the ideas, all of the things that I want to do into the wiki. I haven't been able to just like sit down and write. I've done some writing here and there, but I really tried to get all of my ideas out when I expanded in Lyrica. And I haven't been able to finish that even. So it's an ongoing process. So I just wanted to use this as kind of a way to get my ideas out so that people are aware of them. Because I recently filed a claim, and everyone seems to think that I'm not doing anything because it's not in the wiki, and I get that. So this is me trying to rectify that. I have plans, and I just want to make everyone aware of it. So I'm just basically going to do a stream of consciousness crazy chat about Alduria-Wechua, and I hope you enjoy it. So to explain a little bit about what Alduria-Wechua is, I have to go in pretty deeply on what Alduria and the Wechua Nation were individually. So Alduria was founded around 1669 AN, say 1669 or 1670 AN, in the continent of Eura. So like what ended up happening was that you had millions and millions of Alexandrians, you had millions and millions of Capuchins that all of a sudden they lost their country. Their country collapsed, and their country and a lot of the things that they took for granted, like institutionally, were just gone. It just evolved into the green, you know. It became an unruled area that wasn't claimed by anybody. So it just, in my head, I have an image of the green where it's just pandemonium, where you might have like gangs, bands of people. You might have like some sort of like tribes that move around a lot. You might have people that like try to start countries and they fail, kind of like how Altus started, which later became part of Alduria. Altus is part of the Alduria origin story, because that nation first was founded on some speck of islands that were formerly Alexandrian. And then when the MCS didn't approve that claim, for reasons that I still wholeheartedly disagree with and I thought were bullshit, then I just basically like shifted the plan and wanted to create something bigger at that point. And then the origin story is that the senators and the good people that were trying to make Altus work, even though Altus was a very militaristic, strict stratocracy, okay? In the article, you see me write military dictatorship. That was just me trying to like make it sound a little bit less harsh, but it was a stratocracy for all intents and purposes. The military founded and ran the show, okay? Like it was for them. And everyone else was just like supporting the military in Altus. The military in Altus was whatever was left over from Alexandria that gathered and formed into the Armée Altusienne Unie, the United Altus Army, basically. And it wasn't that strong, it wasn't that big, but it was something. It was basically a set of islands that could defend themselves, and were banding together and were giving control of their defense to the army only because, like, at the time Eura was very empty. Constancia is nearby, but like Constancia have their own things going on, so like they're not trying to rely too much on Constancia at the time. So Altus fails, and all of these people basically pack up and end up in where Punta Santiago is today. Around the time that Altus gets founded, Punta Santiago is a very busy city, and it has attracted a lot of Alexandrian settlers. Not too long ago, the Natopians had settled there, and I think that was the area where, I don't know how to pronounce this. I'm so sorry, everyone. I'm so sorry, Nate. Sechaspolis? Is that what that X sounds like? Like a CH? Well, that's how I'm going to pronounce it. Sechaspolis was a town where, like, I think that's where these people kidnapped the Natopian emperor and took him there. Then the Natopian military goes in and rescues them. Basically, like, carpet destroys the whole fucking place. And then they declaim and they leave. So, like, that's not the exact same spot where Punta Santiago is today in the map, but it's pretty damn close. So I would say, I haven't, like, to be honest, I haven't, like, reconciled that, because when I formed Alduria, I thought that what happened in Sechaspolis would happen somewhere else in Eura. So it was like a mistake on my part, and I didn't realize it until later on Nate pointed it out. So that's something that I have to work with Nate on, and that I have to like write on the wiki how that happened. But anyway, so like all of these people come to Punta Santiago to see what's happening there. There were other Alexandrians and other Capuchins that had gathered there and wanted to found a new country called Alduria. So one of the senators from Altus, this guy called Alejandro Campos, he represented the little island of Alduria that has Alduria City in the map. If you go look, it's there. That's where kind of like the name started for me creatively. But he's one of the good guys, even though he's in the military. He's a Democrat at heart, meaning that not the American Democrat, but like he wants democracy rather than a military dictatorship. So he goes to Punta Santiago with a lot of the people in Altus that saw things his way. Altus is falling apart. The military has basically fallen apart. A bunch of these people go on and defect because they see that what's happening in Punta Santiago, so like there's a constitutional convention meeting there. There's all of these developments happening. You have all of these big names in the Alexandrian diaspora that are there because they are sick of being stateless persons. They're sick of living in the green, and they want to bring some form of Alexandria back. A lot of these people are like clamoring for the return of a nation that they can be part of. Maybe not necessarily Alexandria, but they wanted to be part of a nation. It demonstrated promise. Capuchins were also on the same boat. Their country fell apart, and all of a sudden, Celtia gets overrun by whatever knows the Basarids were doing. I remember that at that point, I just basically tuned the Basarids out. I still basically tuned them out and just like have some form of mutual coexistence where we ignore each other. And, you know, I love it. It's working very well for me. But the Basarids are all over the place. And you see that the Capuchins want to leave. They don't want to be associated with the Basarids. So like the people from Israt, from San Luis, from all of these places in Capucha just want to leave and settle somewhere else. A lot of them go to Constancia. A lot of them go to Natopia. But a lot of them stay in place because they don't really have anywhere else to go. And then some of them land in Punta Santiago hearing that the Alexandrians are trying to come up with something. So they land in Punta Santiago. In 1669 AN, the Republic of Alduria gets founded, the Constituent Assembly, which was drafting the Constitution. Alejandro Campos was part of it. You had a bunch of prominent Capuchins that were part of it. You had a lot of people that were natives of Eura that were part of it, that wanted to build a democracy too. And then out comes the Constitution of Alduria, which I based very much on that of France. So you have the first Aldurian Republic for all intents and purposes. Because I copied it from France, basically. I changed things. I'm not that good at writing constitutions from scratch. I always borrow heavily from multiple constitutions. So, Alduria is founded in 1669. Alejandro Campos becomes its first president. And then the country starts moving forward. Alduria starts growing on the continent. It develops a really good relationship with its nearby neighbors. It's neutral at first. It's neutral in the world battle between the USSO, which is one system of alliances, and the Raspor Pact, which is another system of alliances. The Raspor Pact was founded by Alexandria. So you have a lot of Alexandrians that are very partial to aligning themselves with the Raspor Pact, even if at the beginning they were very suspicious of the pact, because in the past, a earlier ancestor of the Raspor Pact that shared the name was an enemy of Alexandria, was trying to mess with Alexandria all over the world, and was constantly trying to defeat the alliance. At the time, Alexandria was allied with Hamland, which later becomes Capucha, Ashkenazza, and Stormark. That part didn't age well, but, when most of Micros is aligned against you, you kind of try to find friends where you can, okay? And those were the friends that Alexandria had that we could rely on. Later on, things change in foreign affairs. Things change in Micros. People change. Nations change. Nations fall and go. People break up alliances. And now we have, years and years and years later, after the first Resport Pact, a new Resport Pact that's between Shiroth, Alexandria, Natopia, and several other nations. So now you have Alduria that's founded in Eura. It's in one of the most busy crossroads of shipping traffic. It's growing. It has to deal with a local native insurgency when it tries to expand into West Bathars. Alduria is then able to ruthlessly crush that insurgency. And then it reaches some form of constitutional arrangement with the natives of West Bathars, in which the Ladinos, which are the descendants of Ashkenazza, that originally occupied some of that land in Eura. So you have the Ladinos get their own autonomous state or region inside of Alduria. And then you get that the native Eurans get their own autonomous area also in West Bathars. So Alduria is developing, and then we get to 1680 AN, and that's where I'm going to pause on Alduria for now. I'm going to now jump on the Wechua Nation. I'm going to try to go through what led up to this. So the Wechua Nation was founded much earlier than Alduria. So the Wechuas are a people that are native to Celtia. They have always been there. That's my imagination. They've always been there. They're a native small tribe. They have been dominated by the Aterans hundreds and hundreds of years ago. The Aterans went ahead and tried to dilute them and try to kill them off, so they started shipping them to other corners of Celtia. They started all of these pogroms, but the nation survived. Its culture survived. Its anchor is Mount Lacara, which is a very big mountain that's in the middle of the Wechua Nation in the continent of Celtia. So you have this culture that builds its entire nation and culture and religion around this mountain because it's so tall it reaches the sky, and to them it looks like it's actually entering the realm of the sun. So for the Wechua Nation, the highest deity that they have in their faith is the sun, Inti. That's the name of the sun, Inti, the god. And they saw this massive mountain that reached to the skies on a very cloudy or misty day. It half of the mountain is not visible because it's in the clouds. So you have these tribes and these people that build myths and their religion around that mountain, because that mountain is the path to Inti. That mountain comes into contact with Inti and the heavens and the sky. So they build their community and their nation and their culture and their religion around this area, and they stay there. They get dominated by the Aterans, which was a nation that was back in the early aughts was claiming in that area. You have a lot of other nations that come through and dominate that area. I can't recall all of them off the top of my head. If you go to the Wechua Nation article on the wiki, you can see what are the nations that dominated that area and basically subdued the Wechus. So its geography is very mountainous, mainly characterized by the mountains around Mount Lacara and Mount Lacara itself. Then you have the rest of the country where it just becomes a valley. The rest of the country is flat and hilly. And most of the country is mountainous. The first Wechua kingdom is the one that gets founded and recognized first by the MCS. This happens in 1657 AN. Its neighbor next door is Capucha. And the Wechus and Capucha have a very complicated relationship. They are frenemies. Capucha wants to dominate Celtia and become the Celtian power. That's why it butted heads a lot with the Basarids. The Capuchan perspective is that the Basarids are disfigured. They are thieves. They are not very good people because they're cannibals as well that kill their brethren and eat them. And they have all of these really weird things. This is again the Capuchan perspective. That's what they think. They see all of this weird shit. They're like, I don't want to be around this. I don't want this in my neighborhood. So now I'm going to try to stay away from the OOC battles that happened there, but I'm just going to try to give an in-character explanation for that. So you have the Basarids and Capucha butting heads a lot. And the Basarids are part of the USSO. Capucha stayed neutral for a long time, but now that Capucha is gone, I can say this. I was working behind the scenes the whole time with the Resport Pact. We developed a good relationship with a lot of USSO nations, but Capucha never took the USSO seriously because the main thing here was that they were still allied, they were still in bed with the Basarids. So for all intents and purposes, for the Capuchans, the USSO, it was individual countries, and some of them were good and better than others, but Capucha wasn't going to be too friendly to the rest of the USSO because they weren't reining their own people in. So you have Capucha and the Wechua Nation next to each other. They're frenemies. They work together on trade, all of this stuff. Then you have this awkward gap of territory between the Wechua Nation and Capucha. This gap of territory happens because the Wechus don't want to expand too much. They just want to establish their country at first and kind of get their shit together. Governing is not easy for them because they find themselves in a position of having to upgrade the country, okay? So they declare the first Wechua kingdom, which lasts from 1657 AN, founded by Manco Capac, the current king of Alduria-Wechua, and it lasts until 1668 AN. During this time, you have a lot of internal conflict inside the Wechua Nation. So the Wechua kingdom gets established and is very autocratic, mired in the past, mired in tradition. You have a lot of the tribalness still coming through to a modern government. And this starts causing problems. People start organizing. The king outlaws political parties, which is why, still to this day, you don't see any Wechua political party call themselves a political party. They call themselves a club. And it was because there was a case, and I've never written about any of this, okay? This is the first time probably any of you are hearing this. There was a court case that basically challenges in the Wechua Nation, challenges the notion of the party ban. The court rules, after it gets considerable pressure from the government, that outlawing political parties is okay, but the ban doesn't extend it to any other things because the court wants to uphold the freedom of assembly. So political rallies, yes. You gather with your friends to a party where there's pizza and cake, yes. But forming a political party and competing in elections under a political party, that was outlawed. So that eventually feeds into the Wechua Spring. So the Wechua Spring is a huge revolution that happens in the Wechua Nation. It starts in 1661 AN. First, it starts with a wave of both violent and non-violent demonstrations, protests. You start to see that the incumbent government that's in power at the time, they were the Conservative and Royalist Club. So you have the Conservatives and the Royalists that are fighting to preserve the old, the ancien regime. They're trying to keep it. And the fight motivates Wechus to start organizing. The Wechua to start organizing. I'm sorry, I use Wechua and Wechua interchangeably. And like what ends up happening is that the Wechuas bring masses, all of the liberal / socialist / radical / basically anyone outside of the conservative royalist party or club gets together and they're like, we need to change this, okay? Like, we are not a tribe anymore. We are not just an amalgamation of people that are trying to survive. We're a country. So you see these violent and non-violent protests and riots starts in 1661 AN. Then these mainly start around the cities of Apurimac and Rimarima. Rimarima is probably the largest city in the Wechua country because it had a very big manufacturing base around it. So like there were always jobs available and plentiful there. So a lot of people would move from Parap, from the other cities in the Wechua Nation to find jobs there. So like Rimarima is a big city. Apurimac is a city that was very close to that weird gap of territory between Capucha and the Wechua Nation, which becomes the Franja Transversal del Oeste, which means the transversing strip of the West. That was inspired by the peace settlement in Nicaragua after their civil war. Actually, I don't remember if it's Nicaragua or Guatemala. It's Guatemala. Sorry. It's the Guatemala peace deal. So you have this awkward space where you have a ton of Alexandrian and Capuchin refugees that were trying to get into Capucha when Alexandria collapses. So like nearby you had the Alexandrian provinces of Santander, Valencia, and you had Corcovado, which sadly is under Bassarid control, and that's just fucking disgusting to me. But I know they owned it before me. But whatever, I have my taste and opinions, okay? So you don't like it, get over it. But like, so like you have this weird gap when you have all of these refugees trying to get into Capucha, and Capucha's worried about a lot of other things. They're not really paying attention to this. So the Wechus expand and bring that area under their control. And that brings conflict between Capucha and the Wechuas and the Wechua because Capucha wants that territory. And they have the power and the military and the money to just take it from them. Capucha could have invaded the Wechua Nation at any point, overrun it, and just like lock that place up in a month. But Capucha saw it fit to court international opinion and not be so aggressive, because their big fight regionally was with the Bassarids. So you have the Wechua Spring starting up, mainly in the cities of Apurimac and Rimarima, and it's because you have the heavy influence of Capucha, which was a full-fledged constitutional monarchy with a democracy. And then you have the Alexandrians that are used to having that democracy too. A lot of the people are used to having that democracy. So the protests have their root causes on high unemployment. There's high food and fuel prices. People are getting pissed with the incumbent government of the then Inca Bratin, which is the prime minister equivalent. Kayara Maihuasca Sonoko. She is not very popular. The economy is not doing well. The budget is out of control. So you start seeing transmissions on TV from the news in the Wechua Nation of protesters and government officials just clashing, throwing rocks at each other, Molotov cocktails. It's starting to get really violent. It gets really violent in Apurimac because all of a sudden you have this communist guerrilla that comes out of nowhere and starts waging a guerrilla war throughout the country. So you have protesters and government forces in Apurimac and Rimarima that are clashing. The government response is heavily violent and heavy-handed, so this fuels more radicalism in the country. So this triggers larger demonstrations that now reach the capital in Parap. They reach Aquimarca, and they reach Huichillanca. And those last two cities in the Wechua Nation are very important because they're holy sites. And once you bring the holy sites into play, you know shit's getting real. So the government cracks down and fuels the development of an armed uprising. Wechua citizens on Wechua social media, they're very heavily influenced by neighboring Capucha and the past. They become an important driving force for change around the country. This leads to a massive government response. They shut down social media and messaging across the country. They start cutting off internet services from entire areas of the country. They start cutting off electricity. The situation is getting bad. The king, meanwhile, is in his palace. He's very young. He's not exactly sure of what's happening. The Sonoko government is flat out keeping him uninformed on purpose. So, what eventually happens is that the struggle gets so bad that at some point the king wakes up and realizes what's happening. There's a big political struggle. There's a contentious political battle. But the Raspur Pact comes in. The Wechua Nation was a member of the Raspur Pact from the beginning. The Wechua Nation always wanted to be a world player. They recognized that they had Capucha next door, and Capucha could overrun them in 5 seconds. They also were concerned as well about the Basarids, and the Raspur Pact was already on the record as not being a friend to them. The Raspur Pact was on the record willing to aid and help the Wechus to fight off their regional neighbors. So, with the help of the Raspur Pact, the king wakes up, and government forces are eventually triumphant over the communist guerrillas and the more extremist military groups and the radicalized protesters. The political power that follows, the political power struggle that follows is carried out in some form of a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. I still haven't written those details in the wiki. They might be lost in there. They might have some minor references, but like they form as part of the greater peace settlement that gets brokered by the Raspur Pact. The Wechus liberalize. But the ban on political parties remains. The Wechua peace accords are signed. They set the standard of national reconciliation, and then they lead to reforms that liberalize the government as part of the comprehensive peace and political settlement. And this happens in 1666 AN. So that ends the Wechua Spring. Following the end of the Wechua Spring, the reforms that were implemented triggers a national backlash from conservative forces that are still very, very strong. Then you see these counter-reform and conservative forces form militias themselves, and they coalesce around the Conservative and Royalist Club and its military arm that gets formed, the Army of Inti. Sonoko gets thrown out of power, and she thinks that it's unfair that it wasn't by an election, it wasn't by the king, it was a popular uprising that forced her out. So she's still a little sour grapes here. These forces are fed further by support from right-wing Capuchin elements, which makes everything worse, makes the relations between the Wechuas and Capuchia more complicated. So you have this new counter-reform militia that's formed, and they try to stage a coup d'etat called the Counter-Revolution. And watching this counter-coup happen wakes everyone in the country up. It wakes the king up. It wakes the Resport up. The Resport has just invested millions and millions and millions to prop up the country so that they can have a reliable base of operations in Celtia. They're not going to let that fall. They're not going to let that go away. So what ends up happening is that the Resport now again has to help again the king put this out. But here's the thing. The coup was seen by the regular average conservative voter as anti-king. That's not what it was originally, but that's how it gets seen in the press and the media. It gets crushed ruthlessly in the streets of Parap. It was very small, didn't have a lot of support. They were hoping to take over and then just run with it. So they are able to put down this revolt and institute new reforms. And now the country is running around with a little bit more stability. It's like now moving forward after a very difficult time. But here's what happens. The Wechua Spring ends. Sapa Wechua, the king, implements the reforms. He has these massive liberal forces that are now organizing and taking over the country democratically. And the White Plague arrives. And the White Plague destroys Capuchia. Then all of a sudden, Capuchia falls. The whole country, the whole freaking kingdom and empire, which was massive, just falls apart. Folds. So then you have the plague destroying Capuchia. You have the White Plague hurting the Resport in other places. And this plague all of a sudden then starts spreading in the Wechua Nation. And it just starts wreaking havoc. The country just basically recovered from a series of revolutions and counter-revolutions. The Resport is now at this point tending to their own countries as this plague spreads. Which is basically, I just got sick of Capuchia. I got tired of fighting with the Basarids. And I just wanted to move on to a new project. That's really what happened. But, you have to come up with in-character explanations for things. So, Capuchia falls apart. The plague occurs at the same time with a campaign of political subversion that's directed against Haifa, which is a province, a part of Capuchia, by the Basarid Empire. All of this ravages Celtia so badly that Capuchia dies, and then after the collapse of Capuchia, the Wechua state descends into chaos because the country runs out of resources, manpower, funding, and morale to continue. The plague is piling up the bodies everywhere. So this triggers the Wechua exodus. You have a lot of Wechuas that leave, and they go to Constancia, they go to Alduria, they go to Ransonar, they go to Natopia, and they go to a couple other places. The Sapa Wechua gets basically chased out of Parap. He gets chased out of Parap by mobs. And he sets up an exile government in Constancia. And during this time, he takes the opportunity to ram through controversial but thorough reforms about how he wants the new Wechua kingdom to be. He's going to avoid the Sonoko mistakes, he's going to avoid his own mistakes in the past, and he's going to embrace the growing liberalization calls in his country. He also does this because he has to gain the support of all of these disparate parties to restore the country. A lot of people find themselves blaming him and his lack of leadership. But it's a plague. It's a plague that kills people, and it just decimated the country. The country just wasn't in good shape. So, central government collapses. Residents revert to local forms of conflict resolution, whether it's secular, traditional, or royal law. And there's no formal monocentric government in the Wechua Nation anymore. Urban areas like Parap, Rimariba, and Apurimac all of a sudden start building private police forces. Gangs start taking up again. You start seeing the resurgence of the tribal traditions again. And it's just people are leaving. Following the onset of the White Plague and the collapse of the country, the surviving members of the Wechua Nation basically start leaving. And a lot of them, you start noticing that they start putting themselves at the mercy or at the use of anti-Basarid Raspur Pact networks throughout the continent. So, the country has fallen apart. The government is in exile. Then eventually what happens is that with Alduria being born and all of these Wechus coming in, and the Sapa Wechua makes a grand visit to Alduria, and he is a huge hit. Everyone's obsessed with him. He's celebrity status. It's kind of like in The Crown Season 3 when Princess Margaret comes to visit the US, and it's just like pandemonium everywhere. It's kind of like that. A lot of people have some care for him because he's the leader of a country that's fallen. And Alexandrians can relate to that because their own country fell. Their own emperor, Edgar II, had to die in a foreign land. He died in Natopia. The speculation is that he was so depressed and greatly affected by the collapse of his country that he died of sorrow. What we know is that he died of natural causes, but wasn't sick or anything. He just died. And that really affected Aldurians, who are mostly Alexandrians, right? So, you have these people that, see this dude that's, trying to bring his country back, and he's still around. The Wechus still have their leader. And that appeals to them. It harkens back. So, the dude gathers a lot of sympathy. So now he wins support from Alduria and Constancia, the Wechua king, wins support from both of them to reestablish the Wechua Nation. So this period where the country has fallen apart is short. It lasts from 1668 to 1673. 1673 AN, Alduria is already 3 or 4 years old, and it's pretty well established. Constancia has helped the Wechus raise money to fund this. Support from Natopia, especially from Chancellor Ernesto de la Cruz, comes in very, very strongly. So now that the Raspur Pact has subdued the White Plague, they can turn around and basically help the guy. During this whole period, Alduria is still neutral, but you can tell that Alduria and the Wechus are getting along very well, and they're partners. So what ends up happening is that the king returns in 1673 and reestablishes the country. And from there on, he establishes the second Wechua kingdom. And that's the one that we saw all the way up to the merger. The second Wechua kingdom. Now, I haven't really come up with the details in the wiki for all of this. Some of this might be in the wiki already, some of it might not. I still have to figure out what happened during the restoration, and I have to write that article, and the article for the Wechua Exodus, I think all of those are stubs for now. So you have these two countries that have been through a lot, and they're partners, and they're helping each other. So leading up to the merger between these two countries, you have the government of Marco Simmer that wants more integration with the Wechus. I'm not sure that Marco Simmer wanted a merger, but he wanted a close partnership. Alduria then joins... Well, actually, this happened before Marco Simmer gets elected. Alduria joins the Raspor Pact. It stops being neutral. A war breaks out with Gran Varionia. And Gran Varionia has a massive navy massed off the coasts of Alduria with some bullshit, unrealistic blockade that everyone just promptly ignores. But, there's still ships massed there, and people get nervous. So Alduria joins the war and then joins on the side of Raspor Pact and becomes part of the Raspor Pact alliance because the Raspor Pact stepped forward to support Alduria. They were proactive about that. So you have the Committee of Alduria-Wechua Integration. This committee is formed by people that are mainly government officials, key community leaders that want to facilitate the integration of Alduria and Wechua Nation with each other, with the end goal being a dream. They just wanted more integration, but this was the end goal, which was to form a federation between Alduria and Wechua. The roadmap towards the federation gets discussed to death, and nothing seems to happen until Marco Simmer comes into office. Marco Simmer energizes it. The Committee for Alduria-Wechua Integration gets formed, and the talks are ongoing. It's difficult. There isn't a lot of agreements. Then Simmer gets shot. He gets assassinated. You see a period of upheaval and instability in Alduria leading up to the election of Marco Simmer. You have Servanite extremists running into the churches of I forgot the name of the church, but it's a faith that's based in Christianity, that's based in that is in Micros. And you have these Servanite extremists that don't want this church in their midst. It's part of a reaction to the colonialism that Alexandrians and Capuchins and Wechuans are basically doing in Eura. And they start shooting up places. They start killing people. And it's just pandemonium. And that further destabilizes the country. Crime starts going up. Everything starts getting really bad. And Alduria looks like it's on the verge of falling apart and dissolving after Simmer gets shot. So you have these two countries that are trying to work together to survive. The Wechus just basically survived their own collapse, and Alduria seems like it's headed that way. Both of these countries want to stop that. They want to come together, honor their unique cultural national ties, and form something new and strong where they can be a community that takes care of each other. And that's like a very Wechua thought, because the Wechus are very community-based. Then you have the Aldurians that are more like Americans in the sense of like in the rugged individualism, where they're even more libertarian. Like that's why you saw that the Liberty and Democracy Party dominated Aldurian politics until Marcos Semer came along and the country started falling apart, because the libertarians just sat on their hands. They just sat on their hands. They just watched the country shoot each other and kill each other, so they lost the election. And then Marcos Semer comes in. So you see that the Wechua Nation collapses. Alduria is on its way. The Wechua Nation comes back. Alduria seems like it's about to fall apart. The Committee for Alduria-Wechua Integration gets formed in 1685. And then later on that year, once they have a formal mechanism or like a formal institution, they are able to finally form a grand agreement to form the Alduria-Wechua Federation. And this is the Proclamation of Punta Santiago. It gets issued in Punta Santiago. And the grand bargain that gets struck is the Wechus keep their king, and the king becomes the king of the Federation. The guy is popular. Aldurians love him. The Wechus love him for everything that he's done since the Restoration. He's been helping Aldurian communities affected by crime and violence. So like the guy is popular. Basically, they signed him up to be king before he even says yes, because he's going to lend them legitimacy. He's going to make this whole thing look good and get support. Because if you see some of the polling, which you can find in the Committee for Alduria-Wechua Integration, at first it's not looking like people like it. But then once they start signing up all these popular figures, the cause gains steam, and the cause gains a lot of legitimacy in the eyes of people. So that's how Alduria-Wechua came together. I wanted to give you a background, and I kind of probably went overboard with some of the history, but like I wanted you to understand that these two countries have gone through a lot, and that this union is formed because they want to survive. In Micros, during the time that Alduria-Wechua are integrating, you have nearby Gran Varionia go off the map. You have Francia all of a sudden disappear. Thank God. You have a bunch of other countries that are just going off the map. Later on, you see Krasnokoria disappear from the map. So like the collapse of countries is something that happens all the time, and these people want to prevent it. They want Alduria-Wechua forever. They don't want to go back to the fall of Alexandria. They don't want to go back to the fall of the Wechua Nation. And that is a traumatic collective PTSD fear that these people have. And that's why they're coming together into the Federation. Okay, so the Federation gets put together in 1685 AN. The Proclamation of Punta Santiago is issued. Parap in the Wechua Nation gets declared the capital for the executive branch. And then you have Punta Santiago gets declared a other capital for legislative and judicial and like administrative stuff. So the country starts putting itself together. The Proclamation of Punta Santiago creates the Federal Constituent Assembly. And this is basically taking everyone who was elected to the Aldurian Parliament, everyone that was in the Council of the Nation, which is the legislature of the Wechua Nation, and adding a ton more seats for all of the other territories that Alduria-Wechua was expanding to. And this assembly's duty is to draft a constitution, is to create basic laws for the Federation, and start to marry, start to pair, start to put together the union, the Federation. And that starts with laws. traditions, customs, and that's what they were trying to establish. So right now, it's, 1689 AN ended yesterday, so now we're in 1690. I was supposed to have elections for Alduria-Wechua at the end of 1689, so at the end of last month, but I got so caught up with everything else I wasn't able to. But that's basically the end of the Federal Constituent Assembly. What they decide to do is take the proclamation of Punta Santiago, because there were so many things on there that everyone already agreed, and revises it, updates it. They learn from their mistakes. They learn from the mistakes of Alduria and the Wechua Nation, and they take all of this input from so many different people to make this more legitimate, because that's always their fear, that all of this is just all of a sudden going to flip a switch and no one's going to want to be part of it, and then it's going to fall apart. So they're trying over time to add legitimacy, and they've made this incredibly liberal and open document that is going to govern the Federation. And like, that constitution is not finished yet. By the way, if you're an Alduria-Wechua citizen, you are welcome to PM me or let me know in the Alduria-Wechua server that you want to be part of writing the final draft of the proclamation, and I can give you access to the private channel in our server. But so like, this document is created, the Constitution is approved, so now the next step is they're going to have an election, and then they're going to have a confirmatory referendum on the new proclamation, on the newly reissued proclamation of Punta Santiago. So what you have now is the first time that this government that merged these two countries, that's been in office now for 5 AN years, is going to face its first test. The government has spent the last 5 years basically dumping insane amounts of money into a plan called the New Prosperity Plan. And this is basically if FDR and his New Deal were in Alduria-Wechua. Aggressive government intervention in the economy. Though there are moments where like they're trying to figure out how to finance this, and instead of just resorting to bonds and borrowing, they start privatizing a bunch of assets that they said, or they thought, hey, I think we should just leave this to the private sector. So like, you start to see massive liberalization when it comes to the broadcasting. So Alduria had this state-owned broadcaster, kind of like the BBC. The Wechus didn't have that. They just had tons of the Wechus are notorious for their unregulated press. So like, that was very much privately owned for the Wechus. So in that moment, they're trying to find money to be able to afford all of these big ticket agendas that will gain more legitimacy for their regime, gain more support. So they're basically like, like that gif of the baby throwing out money out a window. That's basically what they're doing at every single government program that's public works. So like, you're seeing public transport, dams, aqueducts, railways, highways, all of it. And also Alduria-Wechua establishes a new capital. They decide to build a new capital. So out of the new territory that they gain, called Santander, because they basically reestablished the old Alexandrian province of Santander and then some. They refound the old Alexandrian city of Cárdenas, and then they declare it their capital. And now they are in the middle of basically building a planned city. So like, it's like Brasilia up in there right now. So that's kind of where we're at right now. So like, I've been able to give you a dump all the way up to Alduria-Wechua now. Okay, so that was our episode for today. I really wanted to do a much bigger mind dump to the point where I could talk about the current plans that I have for North Lyrica, South Lyrica, the new provinces, and the expansion that I filed yesterday that didn't get approved. I understand that I didn't get approved because I didn't put the info on the wiki. I'm hoping that maybe the mind dumps will be a quicker way to get information and plans out to people, so that they know what to expect. I'm going to be writing in the wiki. And that's the main purpose of this. So this episode mainly deals with how Alduria-Wechua came about, how it happened, and we'll follow up with more episodes later on. Right now, I am going to sign off. I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care. Thank you for listening.